Kimberly, I saw your message that the mics in here are just very sensitive, so when we get started, you will need to try not to make a lot of noise in the back. I think the road noise you just heard was more tables being brought out. Oh, yes, that's okay. You seem to be doing really great. Yeah.
Alright, yeah. Alright, everyone, let's go ahead and get started. It's 10:03. Welcome. Alright, so we get started with the roll call.
So starting with the vote, first of all, I want to acknowledge that Commissioner Gavin is here today. Thank you, Commissioner, for joining. For being here. Always great when the Commissioner comes and sits here on the meeting. So start with voting members for CCI: Bart Kirkmeyer, Mike Wallace, or Marie Madrigal.
Mike Wallace. Wow, execution.
Brandy Delange for CML. Brandy Delange, nothing heard. Cheryl Garcia. Cheryl did send me an email. I wasn't sure if she was bowing out completely or just going to attend remotely. Tim Kunkelman is here. I really should use the computer that has a good iPad. I always forget the track that was important. All right. All right, so Tim Kunkelman is here. Mary Jane Rasher in Toronto.
On the phone.
Thank you, Mary Jane. Wes Horn. Paula Joseph. Darla Joseph. Nothing heard. We do have one vacant wireless position, which we'll talk about today. I think I saw Monica Aiken on the webcast. Monica, are you here? With Piero? You may need to unmute. There she is. I'm going to put her here. Ray Paddock is here. Jay Slater, Aaron Harris, or Erica Stevens.
Erica Stevens is here.
Thank you, Erica. Daniel Calderon or Susan Myers. I heard a click. Is that Calderon or Susan Myers? I'm going to leave that blank for now. Danette Martin is here. Jeremy Duncan or Jennifer Kirkland. I saw Jennifer. Jennifer is on the webcast and the counter is here. For those of you on the webcast, to unmute yourself, you have to go to the bottom of the screen and click the microphone button.
Jeremy and I are both here if you can hear us.
Oh, we can hear you. Woo. Somebody on the webcast, give me a 5 count.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Right now. Right in the middle there, see how that works. Oh. It sounds that still didn't. I saw Kimberly Culp on the webcast. Jackie Reynolds or Amy Butch, or if I'm mispronouncing.
Yep, we're here.
Can you tell me how to pronounce that name, just so I don't get it wrong?
Book, like boo with a cannon.
It's like a Canadian asking for a book. Beth Dobransky.
Kimmy's probably laughing too.
Jennifer, Beth had you as her alternate. Are you still her alternate for the county as well?
Wrong. That's funny. You can replay back. What is that?
So guys, if you're not speaking to us, please mute your microphone.
That's so right. So wrong. That's funny. Hi.
Hi, Cheryl.
Hi. Oh no.
Is here.
I think I'm muted. Am I muted again?
No, you're not muted.
Jennifer, Beth Dobransky had you as her alternate. Are you still her alternate even though you've moved?
To my knowledge, I am not her alternate any longer.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and remove you as her alternate. We'll leave her blank for now. I'll find out who your alternate is. Bruce Romero, I saw online. Alicia Libran or Paula Nall.
Okay.
Thank you. Jeff Irvin.
Here.
Jeff. Connie Johnson.
On the phone.
Connie. Deanie Shin.
Yes, sir.
You. Tina Butler.
Here.
Thank you. Vicky Pickett is here. Scott Newman.
Hi, Daryl Scott's on the phone.
Scott. John Shear. Or Brandy Seaton. Nothing heard. Mandy Stolsteimer or Matt Gage. Nothing heard. Carl Stevens, Tom Holman, or Monica Million.
Carl Stevens on the phone.
Thank you, Carl.
And Matt was shown on the phone earlier, or on the conference bridge.
Okay. I will go ahead and mark him here. Yep, there's Matt. Patty West, I think I saw. Yes, there's Patty. Okay, so we have 79% in attendance. That's more than we need for a quorum. Vicki, do we want to do a around the table or? So I'm Daryl Branson, State 911 Program Manager for the Colorado Public Utilities Commission.
Vicki Pickett, I'm an operations manager for Jeff.
Shelley Lasansky, Denver 911 manager.
Melissa Librans, from Emergency Communication.
This is a mortgage. Danette Martin, Borden County, Marijuana Director.
Deborah Pratt, Chaffey County.
Mike Wallace, Weld County, representing CCI.
Phil Dugan, Three Counties. Tim Kunkelman with Century Link.
John Gavin, Colorado Public Police Commission.
Stacey Gross, GeoCom.
Deb Rosenbaum with GeoCom.
Luke Adams with the Colorado Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing Blind. Valerie Zuniga with Bandwidth. Erica Stevens with Bandwidth.
Sarah Rollins, State of Florida.
We want to do the film? Or would we rather do the online?
We're
So-
not- we can do the online.
So if you're online and you have not done so yet, please go to the task force webpage. The link should have been in your meeting invite. And you can go to the meetings page and there's a link or a button right on the page that says sign in for March 12th meeting. Please click that button and let us know that you're here. That's how we're doing our sign-in sheet now. And for those of you in the room, you did as well.
Hey, Daryl, this is Jeff. Yeah, I found the link in the agenda, but not in the meeting invite.
Apologize for that. I'll make sure that's in the next slide. So for those of you who are remote, please use the link that's in the agenda.
Good. Approval, okay, so has everybody had a chance to review the minutes from the January 2019 meeting? Any questions, comments, corrections? Can I get a motion to approve?
So moved.
Can I get a second?
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor? Aye. Any opposed?
Slow this one.
Can't catch the coronavirus from speaking.
All right. All right, up next, we've got the Resource Center Board Member election.
Right. I don't remember where we were on this. Let me pull that up. Hold on.
I don't either.
Big old memories,
I know.
can't pull it up.
What was-
Holly just texted me, wants to move the camera, did you see that?
Yeah, I can't turn it any further. Oh, it's stuck.
Oh, okay.
That's all we get. Let's see. That's the About Us page. Okay, here we go.
We got a couple terms up, correct?
Well, this is 2020. So I think what she meant was to the first meeting in 2020. So we were supposed to have board member elections for the Resource Center at our first meeting, and that got overlooked. Vicky's term is up and my term is up. My position is actually filled by the charter of the Resource Center. My position is filled by the Public Utilities Commission. So it's actually only Vicky's position that is up for re-election, unless somebody else wants to make a nomination for a representative from the task force to the Colorado 911 Resource Center. Vicky, are you willing to run again?
I'm willing to run again, but if anybody wants to nominate somebody. Stu.
Are you hoping?
Okay.
Getch, volunteer.
Was that Matt? Did you want to?
Negative. I was asking Vicky if she was hoping someone would want to do it.
I'd move to close nominations.
Automatically elected.
Probably do a vote anyway
Yeah, I think we should.
to
So
accept it.
all in favor to accept the nominations as presented? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Yes.
That was easy.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so wireless representative vacancy.
So, I have to remember the gentleman's name. Cheryl Garcia was nice enough to introduce me to some Verizon representatives at the Colorado Emergency Management Association conference a couple of weeks ago. And they got me in touch with one of their colleagues who works on public safety issues for Verizon. And I told him that we have had a wireless company vacancy on the task force for some time, and asked him if he would be willing to fill that position. He did come today, but then he had to leave immediately because of stuff that his company's working on regarding coronavirus. They're actually setting up Wi-Fi hotspots and testing centers and things like that. And his name is Jared Joseph Steger. And he did say that he was willing to take that position on the task force. He's aware of how often we meet, and he's willing to participate. So I will, because we still have a vacancy for wireless position, I'm going to ask if, first of all, if there are any other nominations, and if not, since he's self-nominated, I would ask the task force to vote on that nomination.
Are there any other nominations for the wireless representative vacancy? Cheryl, did you have something?
Cheryl said Daryl.
Yes.
This is for Daryl. Cheryl is typing. She said, "You're welcome."
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Just,
Did you get my report?
Did you add your standing reports?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay,
Thank you.
all right, we'll have that on the agenda then later. Okay, hearing no other nominations for the road representative, can I get a motion?
Hi, this is Kimberly. Can I jump in real quick, Vicki?
Please.
Sure.
I just had a question. I thought that Sprint possibly was interested in a seat from our conversations with them working on the legislation.
Do you know of anybody that they were going to nominate, or?
I don't, but I'm just trying to refresh my memory. Did Greg mention that? Daryl, do you recall?
I remember the topic coming up, but I don't remember them committing to anything.
Okay. All right.
Do you think we should wait until we can talk to them some more before we?
No, I think if Verizon is interested and they expressed interest, then that's a great decision.
Okay.
So can I get a motion for the nomination for the wireless representative vacancy for the representative for Verizon?
This is Kimberly. I can make that motion.
Thanks, Kimberly.
I'll second.
Okay, Ray Paddock seconds. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. Up next, we've got the PUC staff update.
So, as some of you saw, we're doing standard reports a little bit differently. So I'm sending out a request for written reports to all standing report participants prior to the meeting, so that they can go into one document that will then be in the meeting folder. The idea is that we won't then necessarily have to go through everything in the in-person meeting. You can read it, and then if you have questions, you can ask those questions. But if there's anything that you, as a standing report member, you want to highlight, the in-person meeting will be the time to do that. So all of my PUC staff report went into that written report that's in there. One thing I did want to highlight for those of you who are listed as the primary contact for 911 authorities or public safety entry points, I've been sending out this map, which I put together to show which agencies we have 2020 profile updates from and which ones we don't. I think that some people might be a little confused on how to use it. So there's a link in there to get to the interactive map. If you are a 911 authority representative, you have to click on the background. So you see, for instance, San Luis Valley is the big block at the bottom that actually encompasses 6 different counties that is red right now. If it's red, that means we have not received a 2020 profile from you. You would have to click on the background of that county, of that 911 authority's boundaries to get the link to update the profile. If you're a PSAP representative, then you have to click on the map pin. So you can see how some of the map pins are red and some of them are green. You click on the map pin for the PSAP, and that will pull up the link for that PSAP. So we keep different profiles for the 911 authorities and different profiles for the PSAP. And I think some people have been confused as to which one they click if they're trying to update it. So that's how you do it. I'm trying to provide a more graphical interface to help people see whether their 911 authority or PSAP hasn't turned that in yet. As a reminder, the data that we collect through that is voluntary, but it's extremely appreciated because it's used to complete the annual reports to the Federal Communications Commission, as well as the National 911 Program Office, and to the General Assembly in our annual updates from the Public Utilities Commission's 911 program. So we do really appreciate you filling those out. And I know that the Resource Center also uses the data in there to do things like salary studies, to get to, you know, if you're asked a question like, what is the average age of a 911 CPD in the 911 center in Colorado, they can get that data from there. And the more complete that data is, the more accurate. So we do really appreciate it. I think everything else I wanted to touch on in my report will be touched on through the other standing reports. So I think that's it for now, unless anybody has gone through my standing report and has any questions they would like to ask. Okay.
All right, thank you, Daryl. Okay, up next we've got the BESP report, CenturyLink.
So, a couple things, Tim Cumberland. One, we're continuing to work on the ESI net transition. We were able to turn up a couple just this morning. Yes. The Westminster just this morning. I know that if you look at the schedule, it looks a little behind, and that's a true statement. But what we're going to do is we're going to start going to our schedule had 2 days a week that we were going to do these, and now we're going to start moving that to 3 times a week to do a little catch up. I think we're kind of starting to find the groove a little bit, working out a few little bugs in there. And I know that we were working with RETSA, and we've identified about 20 others that have what we call remote PSAP. So that means a PSAP that's behind the DMARC. So you all are routing the traffic behind the DMARC. We've learned of the abandonment device to sort of make busy of the E111. And so we're working on some things that will facilitate those transitions for you all that have those scenarios. And we'll talk more about that at the user group meeting next week. We're still working with a little bit with Intrado on and our own product folks on kind of coming up with a good solution that we'll roll out. We have no intention of making it be a fee. Now there could be some cost if depending on some stints that we might have to pick out if you all on something within your facility, but we're not going to think the terrible charges. So that's something that more to come on that, but I want to give you a little heads up. And then we're beginning to work on the contingency plan. It's not due till the end of next month, but we've begun kind of a cursory review. I imagine some of you have been contacted by, I don't know if you've been contacted for her, but a woman in our group called named Sandra Lott. She is working on all of your contact information. So we're just trying to make sure that we have the right email addresses, the right point of contact, all those types of things. So that's kind of an audit that's going around right now. So you may be getting contacted about that. So please make sure you respond, and we've got all of your updated contact information. We'll put that into our profile, and then I'm going to pull the data out as we get closer to the end of April, so I can get the most current. That'll go into the contingency plan, and then of course you'll be hearing from Lisa Sheridan about your condition routing, and that stuff should all be happening in the next few weeks as well. So again, please respond to those. And then again, I'll pull that data into the report or the plan. And then because we are beginning the transition to NG and the ESI net, some of the things are going to change within the contingency plan. Some of the things that are there right now are really more specific for E911. So as we prepare the report, I'm creating a few different, either maybe a little bit of a different section or at least a notation that says, hey, this thing is historically E911, and in the NG, this is going to be part of the contingency, and this is what that means. And I'm going to work with Intrado and just some of the abandonment type scenarios and trying to capture all that. So hopefully, I don't know if you want to talk about that. Maybe let's see, we won't meet again. No. Well, maybe I'll at least go through with you, Daryl, to see if we can, like make sure we kind of hit some things and if there's I suppose we could even into something. Again, as the environment's changing, I want to make sure that this thing is staying or is changing with that, and that it's capturing it. Those are the things that I have.
We can always communicate by email with the task force.
So to move the question on the, so the police shared information out on the condition routing, that's not something that can be rolled over from the legacy stuff then?
Oh no, it definitely is. We're just kind of confirming. I know that we've run into scenarios here and there where somebody's phone number changed or it was an email address that if they're gone, so I know we've worked with some of you on kind of creating more of a distribution email kind of thing. It's just trying to make sure the data's correct and that the numbers are working. I know we were talking to some with Pretzel where they've got it on the application in Allen's Park Fire, I think, and so and that's a switch that is an automatic rollover. It doesn't require any physical activity. So try to figure out, was that the right location and that number makes sense. So there's just stuff like that. We just want to make sure everybody's kind of thinking about where these calls make sense.
So we have a standing report section for the assignment users group. This is where we're talking about this event. We want to handle it now, or we not?
Oh, I saw Bruce just ask a question. Bruce, this is just the annual contingency plan report that we file each year at the commission.
So yeah, Bruce, the PUC rules require BDSP to file a contingency report every year by April 30th. Is that right? And it's very basic. Just basically what happens if there's an outage at a PSAP. So it covers contingency routing, the condition for routing. It's showed it as a confidential filing, all of the phone numbers that Synchrony has on file for the 7-digit rollovers for condition 4 routing, that sort of thing.
And then it has even like where some of the location is of some of the equipment. And so that's something that's going to change with the ESI now. We've got to bring in Miami and Cedar Falls and
Kimberly asked, what was the name of the person that would be reaching out to confirm contact information? There were 2 names.
Sandra Lott is doing the contact audit information. So it's her mixing up from her team. And then Lisa Sheridan is the contingency route.
And Bruce asks, have we thought about COVID contingency if PSAPs are on lockdown during the migration date?
Sounds like a good user group topic in Maui in 6 days, right? In 6 days, who knows?
Right. It's changing every day.
Yeah, so let's, Bruce, I guess we can talk about that next assign a user group meeting. I think I certainly have not thought about that. Kimberly says she couldn't hear her name. It's Sandra Lott. Sandra Lott. L-O-T-T.
Okay. Any other questions for Cynthia?
So Bruce, or I'm sorry, Daryl, I couldn't hear the answer. Are we going to ask questions now about the NG91 project, or do you want us to wait till later?
You said yes.
Okay, so I understand from a schedule perspective, and you guys are going to move to 3 a week. I just have to say I'm concerned about that. I think that's a lot to commit to. even with the delays in trying to schedule in these PSAPs from the end of the project perspective, we're still in a good place, even if we have to tack people on towards the end. And it's not so much the day of the cut, things go pretty smooth. It's leading up to the cut and the team and your team and the resources, and then all of us are competing for the same resources for the CPE side of all the work that has to be done. So I'm just wondering how much conversation has been had with PSAP's authorities or the CPE vendors about moving it up to 3 cuts a week. Because it's all that work leading up to the cut that is a draw on resources.
We're in constant communication with the ones that are coming out, so it's not us just driving it, it's a collaborative.
And a temporary one too.
And a temporary one too.
We don't think that, going to 3 days a week, we'll insert those, when it makes sense, but we also won't go much, say a month, thereabouts.
So is it just to make up kind of for some of the folks
Yeah, I
that
mean,
were not on schedule?
we have most of the work has been done, even to look at the schedule for locations that are out in June and July, we're pretty well set. It's just finding these little nuances here, a circuit here, a circuit there kind of thing. Sometimes it's the secondary circuit that we want to make sure that we don't want to cut, and then it's just a single thread, right? So it's just some of those things, or just some of it has been working with the PSAP or authority vendors and things like that, and equipment locating and stuff. And so it's been little nuances. I wouldn't say that it's anything really that we're behind on critical pieces. It's got to be perfect, right? So,
Right, so the intention when you're kind of ramping up for cutovers is to catch up, right, for the calendar.
if it makes sense.
Yeah.
Adams County and roar it back up, it's essentially almost locked and loaded, but those are the things that we can convert to. Once those fall into place, set up.
Kimberly, does that answer your question?
It does. I mean, I understand the pieces of it, and I guess it's just hearing and being on the EZNet user group and listening to the calls every week on just all the moving pieces. I'm just concerned. I think that obviously CenturyLink wants to get the project done. We do too. I just get concerned about trying to pull too many resources and having their attention split too much, and then that creates problems because then we're missing details. So I just wanted to throw that out there as a concern. On the other side of it, though, the delays haven't all been caused by CenturyLink, and to be fair and to make sure everyone understands this, we have a responsibility on the 911 side, and we're not always doing our part. We're not coming to the table with the right people, the right resources, making sure that we're ready to go and asking the questions we need to make sure our end is dialed in and ready to go. So I just want to point that out, that we are creating our own delays too, and the PSAP's authorities need to get that fixed.
Great. So, is there anything else? Yes, ma'am.
Anything else on the EZNet or ESP report?
Darrell, Joe Benkert here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, oh yeah.
I guess the other concern I would have with expediting it is, I've heard comments on the ESINet user group calls about CenturyLink techs coming out to do surveys and things that don't know what they're doing, and that could only be exacerbated if they're calling in resources that additional resources that aren't already working on this in order to meet the accelerated schedule.
I'm just gonna leave that there.
Well, and that's actually a very valid point. We've talked about this at the EZNet user groups, and we've talked about it with CenturyLink, is there is a problem with techs showing up that haven't been in a 911 dispatch center. They don't know what they're doing for the survey, and they aren't sure to really gather the data, what data they're gathering. So they don't have a clear picture of the scope of the project. So the CenturyLink team that's been on our calls should be well aware that this is a problem, and it has resurfaced again in our recent dialogue. So I think Joe's concern is well placed, and I hope the project team with CenturyLink can hear that and make sure that they're prepping the folks that are coming on site to do these surveys better.
Yeah, understood, Kimberly. We thought we had that under control. We're going to be focusing on that. I believe since the lessons learned.
Okay. Any other questions regarding the EZNet? All right, next up we've got the ESP report from Toronto. Mary Jane, did you have anything?
I don't have anything to report today. Thanks, Vicki.
Daryl, Agenda Committee.
Just that a link to the agenda committee page is in the standing report document, and as always, if anybody has any suggestions for speakers or topics, let them know.
Okay. Bylaws Committee, Kimberly, any update?
Not since I provided that update. I have completely been overtasked, so I haven't been able to regroup the bylaws. So I do apologize for that. We do have some open items we need to tackle, but I just haven't had the bandwidth to do that yet. And it's not a pressing priority for us. Some minor changes need to take place on the bylaws, but definitely hope I can get to that soon.
Cheryl, did you have something? Next on the agenda, we've got the Legislative Committee.
Athena and Jackie are both at the Capitol building right now, so they're not able to provide an update. House Bill 1293, which is the 911 surcharge reform bill, is in the Finance Committee this morning. It may have already been discussed, I don't know, but just to check. Didn't hear anything from Jim?
No, she said the hearing's still going on.
It's still going on, okay.
So I was checking.
There were a couple more minor amendments that were going to be introduced today. One regarding Lifeline, carving out a exception for that so that they don't have to pay the full 911 fee that everyone else would have to pay, because it would be a sizable portion of the federal subsidy they get for Lifeline, as well as a request that was made by Department of Regulatory Agencies, my employer. But they're both fairly minor. They won't have a huge impact on the rest of it. I give a little bit more of an update. I know that we have support from the Fire Chiefs Association, Police Chiefs Association, the Sheriff's Association, CWA is in support, CCI and CML are both in support. And we don't have anybody actually officially opposing the bill. The only person who testified to oppose at the first hearing was from CTIA. After the hearing, however, the CTIA being the wireless industry, after the meeting, a CTIA representative told us that that person was not really authorized to speak on behalf of all of CTIA. They were representing the views of TracFone. And since we're dealing with the Lifeline issue now, hopefully that opposition will go away. So actually looking pretty good at this point. You never know. And I heard on Colorado Public Radio the other day, there's actually talk about possibly suspending the legislative session if the coronavirus gets any worse. So let's hope that that doesn't happen before our bill passes. But regardless, I've watched a lot of bills go through over the years, and it's actually got a lot of support right now, so it's actually. But Kimberly, you've been very involved in this as well. Do you have anything to add?
No, I think that's a good update from a big picture perspective. We were worried that CTIA was going to oppose us, but it's definitely not CTIA. If we do have any opposition, it's going to be TracFone. But I think with the amendment being introduced on Lifeline, we've isolated any other wireless carrier concerns at this time, which is fantastic.
Joe Benkert here. Can you explain the amendment on the Lifeline better? Because I know when that came up before, that was a really large concern for some of the rural authorities who had a very large percentage of their constituents who were receiving Lifeline service.
Yeah, from a big picture perspective, Joe, the language is solidifying the fact that they will remit E911 surcharge. So
Oh, great.
making it very clear. And also just from the documents that are filed, it's very clear that carriers that are certified as Lifeline providers are not all paying the same percentage into the 911 surcharge. So we're calling for parity on that, which will, if it's a range of 1.3 to 1.9%, that the PUC will set that at, call it 1.6%. And then the PUC can look at it, review it annually, and make an adjustment, but not to exceed 1.9%. So it's just solidifying, one, the 911 surcharge shall be paid, two, that all the carriers shall be remitting the same percentage on their Lifeline services instead of this huge range that we're seeing. And then also third is allowing the PUC to make adjustments, but not to exceed a certain percentage amount.
That's a great amendment.
It's a great amendment, and it's got the support of Sprint, which is fantastic. And I'm sure we'll have some opposition from TracFone, who doesn't think they should have to pay the 911 surcharge, but we'll tackle that when it happens.
And Joe, just to correct something, so I checked with USAC, which is the federal agency that administers the Lifeline program. According to them, we have less than 50,000 Lifeline subscribers in Colorado, and that includes the landline Lifeline subscribers. So I think the amount is actually very small. And for the prepaid Lifeline subscribers, remember that prepaid goes into a pot at the Department of Revenue, and then they distribute it based on wireless call volume. So where they live really doesn't have any effect on how much the local agencies receive.
An incredible amount of work that the legislative committee has done on this.
Hey, Daryl, it's Goodwin.
Yes, Tim?
You indicated CWA is supportive, but they were testifying about an amendment at the previous committee hearing. What's the status of that?
To my knowledge, that amendment has not been, is not planning, there is no amendment based on their request that is being planned to be introduced, if that makes sense. Like, that's not the best way to word it. But yes, they have made an ask, a couple of asks, but to my knowledge, the sponsor has not put together an amendment for that yet.
And they're still on board, notwithstanding the fact that their ask has not been granted.
Correct. They support the bill either way, but they do have an ask regarding the amendment. So what CWA is asked for is 911 outage reporting for telecommunications providers, as well as giving the commission authority over consumer complaints for telecom. But to my knowledge, those are not being introduced as amendments at this point.
What does that this time mean?
It means that I cannot predict the future. My crystal ball is hazy.
Yeah, and I think to that point, we just don't, all these people will keep popping up with amendments. I think that's typical in a legislative session, but Tim Goodwin, your testimony during the bill of keep the integrity of the bill as the bill was intended, all these amendments can start to deviate the bill's intent. And that's what we're really trying to focus, especially when Jackie and Athena are talking to our bill sponsor, is there's always going to be people pulling in and wanting additional pieces to it, but let's say no and let's move forward as we are today.
Okay, thanks for the update.
Anything else legislative committee-wise? Senate Bill 26, by the way, my understanding is it is passed its second reading on the House floor, and I've been told that next it goes to the governor's office. And Senate Bill 26, by the way, was the requiring workers' compensation to cover vicarious trauma for 911 telecommunicators.
Daryl, it's scheduled for the second hearing tomorrow.
Oh, tomorrow? Okay. So it's got one more hurdle to go through, but there's no opposition to it, so it's pretty much a good move.
Okay. Equal Access Committee, Cheryl, do you have an update?
Cheryl, I believe something. Let me see if I can find it.
Hi.
Hey there.
She said, all right. She said, hold on. Cheryl has written, she says, this has been a very busy quarter. We participated in the Colorado Office of Emergency Management Conference. The CEMA conference had close to 600 attendees. I was able to confirm the Embassy Suites did, in fact, change their policy, and they were compliant with direct dial to 911. I explained the reason why they changed that policy was Kerry's Law. I also shared the capability to text to 911. The hotel was not aware of that. Luke did a presentation on effective communication with people who are hard of hearing, deaf, or blind deaf. In that, we learned you should you be in a position to evacuate, and if you come across a person who is HOH, hard of hearing, deaf, or deaf blind, with your finger drawn on that person's back and X, they will know they need to evacuate immediately. And Cheryl says, please don't use a Sharpie for that. Daryl presented on Colorado IP-based 911 mitigation. I have heard it went well. We attended Denver's Alerts and Warnings work group. She says, Holly has offered to do a training on various communication devices and ways such as different relay capabilities, voice over, speech-to-speech, video relay. Cheryl says, I have joined Nina's, accessibility, accessibility committee. She says, the rest of my report will be emailed out. I've included various ADA trainings and webinars that can be done on your own. And they are what? They're an hour each. I want to suggest a FEMA IS, and it's independent study, IS 368. It is at training.fema.government/IS. Cheryl's waving me off. She said that'll be included in her report. Yeah, people will need to have a FEMA student ID for that, and their upcoming webinars that Cheryl will include a link to. Anything else, Cheryl? Any questions?
Any questions for Cheryl?
And just so everyone knows, I did get that report, an email from Cheryl this morning, and I just added it to the standing report document, so it's in there if you want to look at it later, including the link that she had.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
As of today's date in 2020, we have the same number of outages that we had in 2018 and 2017, so no huge spikes so far this year. We had one outage in January, one in February. Again, I always have to give a disclaimer, we're not talking about all telecommunications outages, we're only talking about basic emergency services outages, which start at the ingress to the 911 network, usually the selective router, and end at the demarcation with the public safety answering point. Duration of outages this year have been kind of high in average, but we've only had 2, so it's not a very good sample to choose from. Customer count has been low. Average impact has been low because of that low customer count. outages that we've had so far. One was caused by an accidental cable cut. One is unknown so far. We don't have the final report on that yet, so that'll probably change to something else. And both of the outages we've had have been alley only. What else was I going to say? Oh, we do have several. So on this, if you go to the committees page and then go to the outage committee, so that was the outage dashboard, which is on the 911 Task Force webpage. If you go to the outage committee page on the 911 Task Force website, there is a special investigations box at the bottom. We do have 3 special investigations going on right now. One is the last outage we had in 2019, and we had 2 in 2000, basically the 2 that we've had so far in 2020, both qualified for special investigations. There are various triggers for those, including if it lasts longer than 4 hours, which I think was the case on both of these actually. And then one of them also affected multiple PSAPs, which is also a trigger. So the outage committee will be looking at all 3 of these and creating a final special report, which will be attached to our next report from the commission to the from the task force to the commission, and that gets filed in a proceeding that the commissioners then have access to, as well as the public. Does anybody have any questions regarding the outage committee?
Prepaid and collections committee, and of course Jackie Louise is at that hearing. Do you have an update?
Just what she put in her written report, which is that she would like to set up a meeting to discuss how wireless statistics will look in the transition to the ESINet. One thing we discussed when we were coming up with the percentages for the prepaid wireless distribution this year is that in the past we've always used alley retrieval reports. In the future, we expect the reports that we're getting through the ESINet reporting tool to be more accurate than what we're getting through the alley retrieval, because it'll be actually counting calls, not alley retrievals. But the issue is, what do we do during the time when we have PSAP, some PSAPs on the ESINet, so they're getting that reporting, and some PSAPs not on there. So I think that's what Jackie would like to discuss, so we'll just wait for Jackie to schedule that, I think.
Any questions on the prepaid or collections? Moving right through this.
Yeah. There's written standing report, I think is helpful.
Yeah, it is. Okay, so reports committee, Daryl.
So the task force makes 3 reports to the commission every year. March which basically means every other meeting, we have a report to the commission. March is one of those times. I did provide in the meeting folder, there is a draft of the task force report. I did send that out to the reports committee prior to adding it to the meeting folder. The only comments I got back were from Joe Benkert. Joe, thank you for that, and I did incorporate a good number of your comments. If hopefully people have had a chance to look at it, and if so, I would ask the task force to approve that report to the commission. I'll go ahead and pull that up right now. We have the actual report as well as both Appendix A and Appendix B. Appendix A is a snapshot of the outage dashboard as it was as of February 25th, and Appendix B is text to 911 status list. If anybody has any questions or corrections or changes they would like to suggest, I think now would be the time.
Are you looking for an approval today for that? Or?
Yeah, so I sent it out a couple of weeks ago, so my hope was that everyone would have a chance to look at it before the meeting so they could vote today.
Any other comments or questions or corrections or updates or anything that you identified when you reviewed this? Hearing none, I would ask for a motion to approve this report.
So bad.
Thanks. Second. Wessel, second. Any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Thanks for your work on that, Daryl.
Thank you.
So do we have anything else to review on the ESNet users group? that, put that in, we did that before.
Only thing I want to add is, we kind of missed a step. Looked at the charter for the users group recently and realized that we were supposed to have a election of officers for the users group at the first meeting of the year, and we didn't. So be watching. I'll be sending out a request for nominations. We'll give it a couple weeks, and then we'll have an election by email. I know Bruce was interested in stepping down from the chair position of that. Kimberly is currently the co-chair and has expressed an interest in taking the chair position, but we'll take any nominations. Obviously, we'll need a new co-chair unless Bruce wants to take. If Bruce and Kimberly want to switch, we'll see if that happens. But we'll take any and all nominations. You do have to be a representative of a local 911 authority in order to take those positions. Currently, I am the secretary, and if you want to be the secretary instead of me, that's fine too. It is a very, there's actually not much to being the secretary. I'll still run the webcasts either way, whether I'm the secretary or not. So if somebody wants to take that position, they can.
So, but you're gonna do that by email then?
Yes, we'll do all of that by email.
Okay. Anything else, any other questions for the ZNet users group? Okay, next up is the 911 Colorado Foundation. I'm here to give an update on the organization. We have decided that we are going to dissolve the organization, the foundation. We appreciate the agency's supports and the authority board supports. However, hasn't had a lot of activity over the last few years, and funding has not been there, so we have made the decision to dissolve the organization. So, Joe, do you have anything to add to that?
So Vicki, does the foundation have any assets that it has to account for?
That's what we're going to work on now. That's what that
Yeah, the foundation does have a couple $1,000s, and I need to get with you, Darrell, to make sure that we can transfer it to the resource center. I think you said you might be set up as a private foundation, and I have to see if that's qualifies for us to transfer the money to.
Okay.
All right.
This is Darrell. Holly has reminded me, because she's always good at this, and I sometimes forget. Anybody speaking either in the room or on the phone, please identify yourself by your name at the beginning of speaking, so that the sign language interpreters can provide that information to their client.
Got it. Okay, so this is Vicki. Update the Colorado Public Safety Broadband updates next on the agenda.
This is Darrell. Is Ed Mills on the call? I see him on there.
Okay. Vicki again, PSCS update for report. Deanie.
The only thing I have to report is a short meeting last week. House Bill 1282, which was the radio communication decryption, was defeated 6-5 for this year. May come back next year. Yes.
This is Darrell. With everything else that's been going on for me, I haven't been tracking that. Was that one that the PSCS opposed?
Yes.
Okay.
And it failed 6-5.
Wow.
Close.
That's close. Else?
No.
Okay, again, the next is the SWIC report on page.
This is Darrell. Is Glenn on the call? See him.
Okay. And then last one is the Division of Fire Prevention and Control report. Monica, and I know she's actually out of pocket right now on travel, but I actually attended in her stead last meeting, and I'm also attending in her stead next meeting while she's out. And basically, I don't have a whole lot to report. They're starting to come up with their agenda on what kind of things they're going to be focusing on. The last time we met, the climate was a little bit different than it is right now, so the focus may have changed by the time the next meeting happens, but they had some primary objectives, which I should have brought, I don't have them, but they were focusing on several different items. Some of it was statewide coordination and auto and mutual aid agreements, that kind of thing, as well as employee health. It's another good one. They're starting to come up with a lot of cases where they've got some responders that have been exposed and had some issues, so that's going to be, there was 4 items. So, but I believe we meet again, meeting's still on. Next week. And so they do a quarterly meeting, so.
And this is Daryl. I just want to, I should have said this at the beginning of the meeting, but I feel a little sheepish today that I did not cancel this and turn this into a remote meeting. So bravo to you brave souls who are here in person. The situation just escalated a lot faster than I anticipated. Otherwise, I would have suggested to Vicki that we turn this into a remote meeting. So if anybody feels like I was, I dropped the ball on that, I agree with you and I apologize.
All right. Okay. Let's see.
So unless anybody has any old business that's not on the agenda.
Business? Hearing none. All right, so new business.
First item, creation of a GIS committee. At the last task force meeting, we had a presentation from, it's Datamart, is their DBA, it is
Michael Baker.
Michael Baker, thank you. And her suggestion, the presenter is formerly the director for the state of Arizona, and she talked about the project that they had in Arizona to get their GIS data, next generation 911 ready. And her suggestion was that we start the way they did, which was to create a committee to bring local and state 911 people and vendors all to the table to talk about what is needed for next generation 911, take an inventory of what's available, and to start making some plans as to how to move forward. And I know everybody's committed out, but I really do believe she's correct on that item. What I would suggest is that we not only create a GIS committee, but that we make sure that it is populated by GIS people. That will potentially include some of the same people in this room, but it's going to also need to include some people who are not in this room, because the people who really know about GIS, with a couple of exceptions, are not the same people as the 911 people. I can see Matt Gage being on there, and there may be some other 911 people that would be particularly helpful on there, but we're going to need to get some GIS experts on there as well, in addition to the few that straddle both worlds. So my suggestion is that we create a GIS committee. I'm happy to get the meetings going, but then I really want the GIS professionals to take over the meeting and run with it from there. So I guess at this point I would ask if anybody has any thoughts on that. Would you think it's a good idea, bad idea? And then if everybody thinks it's a good idea, to hold a vote on it. Well, I guess we don't need a vote because actually the chair of the task force can create committees at will. So let's have some discussions.
Darrell?
Joe?
Joe Benkert here. The state OIT was working on a project to take GIS data from the different counties, and I think they spent a lot of time and money getting it into the same formats and the same standards. I think the guy who was mostly in charge is no longer with them, but if there's somebody at State OIT who is still on that project, I think they should also be a member of this committee.
I think that was broadband, wasn't it? The broadband group?
Yeah.
Well, Nathan Lowry used to be with OIT and did a lot of that work, but John Gottsagen, who was here today, actually is going to be presenting to us lunch. Is very familiar with all of that work. And yes, I definitely agree with you, Joe. I believe that state OIT should have a position on that committee, assuming that state OIT is willing to do that. I'm volunteering them, and they're even in the room.
So, yeah.
Great.
to be on the committee, though I'm far from an expert in that area.
This is Matt. The committee's a great idea.
Thank you, Matt.
I do think that it's really important. Otherwise, we're going to end up with a bunch of disparate data models, which we probably already are in the process of happening.
Not only that, we're not going to be able to move forward on some of the next steps to get there. I'm sure it's going to be an essential piece of that.
Correct.
Any other thoughts?
You want to wave your wand and create the committee?
Yeah, so I think we will create that GIS committee. How do we typically do sign-ups for that kind of thing? We just people get email interest?
Yeah, so I can send out an email asking for people and really encourage people to send it to their GIS person if they're not part of the task force, because otherwise they're not going to hear about it.
Yeah.
And if it's all right with the group, I'll go ahead and share it to start, but then I'd like to identify a leader in that committee to turn it over to once we get going.
So this is Ray. So a couple of questions. Everybody knows Ray. So would it make sense to create at least a charter so that when people are thinking about who they need to have participate, they've got something that says, here's the outputs, here's what this group is going to be worth.
Okay.
And would it make sense at some point, either now or after the group is constituted, to actually take a look at what other states are doing and how they're organized?
For sure.
Especially, where the leadership comes from. A lot of times, like in California, it's the prime contractor that will lead the effort. Individual counties still have to contribute and so forth, but so there are a bunch of different models. And so maybe a survey of what other states are doing. Colorado's always different, and so I'm not saying they should follow anything, but to be able to understand what's going on. So one or more people that have the opportunity to look out and say, here's what's going on in these other states, take it or leave it. And again, you could do that before you form the committee, or you could wait for the committee to be formed and then have that as a first pass.
Definitely.
So that's a very good idea. I do think that that should probably be the first duties of the committee, because I think the experts that will be able to do that kind of research will be the people that we call into that.
Potentially, they're the experts at it, but a lot of the people that are in GIS in Colorado, this is Ray again, probably haven't had time to look at it what other states are doing. And so they may not have to other states and so forth to do that, but I understand.
Well, this is Daryl. I'm happy to do that initial research too. Reach out through National Association of State 911 Administrators, find out. I already have some documentation from other states as to what they've done, but I can certainly do more and use that to help inform the communities.
Great. Okay, so Daryl's going to send out an email, just basically asking for interest, and please go back to your respective entities and speak with your GIS reps. It's going to be really important that we have some good involvement, particularly from those that have less developed systems than others, right? So, because we're going to have a serious different set of data, like you said. So, awesome. Okay. Next up, we've got the discussion of the best practices webpage draft.
So at the last meeting, we approved the annual update to the standards document. So just to refresh everybody's memory, Commission rules require the task force annually to update a document with recommended standards for the Commission to consider when they're reviewing 911 related proceedings. It's not an incorporation by rule. It's just a recommended list of standards for the Commission to consider. When we did that last time, there was some discussion as to whether we should also include best practices. And where we ended up in that discussion was that there was a suggestion that maybe we have a separate document that lists best practices for 911 centers to follow that are just recommended by the task force. They're not required, but they would just be there as a resource. I started to try to put something together like that as just a document, and after doing some work on it, I decided that a better format for that might be a web page. So the link in your agenda will take you to a draft web page. This page is not publicly searchable yet, so it doesn't show up if you search for this, but it is there if you want to find it through that link. And I categorized a number of best practices from both APCO and NENA into various categories. Didn't necessarily use the same categories that APCO and NENA use. I tried to make it as user-friendly as possible so that people can find best practices related to different topics. I don't know that if anybody's had a chance to look at this yet, even though it was included as a link in the agenda. I don't know that people realize that that link was there. If you have had a chance to look at it and you have any feedback for me, that's great. Otherwise, I would just encourage people to take a look at this, see if you think there's anything that's missing, anything that's miscategorized, any best practices that are out of date. And this will go for anybody who participates in the task force, provide me some feedback on this. And then maybe at the next task force meeting, we can vote on whether or not to make this page public and send it out to the PSAPs for their, just as a resource for them. And of course, this could also be linked from the Colorado 911 Resource Center page as well. So has anybody had a chance to look at this yet?
Yes, you have some good questions.
Okay. Some good topics, you mean, or?
Yeah, yes, good topics, yes.
I have not had a chance to review it, sorry.
That's okay. I didn't. Bonus points for Deanie for actually looking at the agenda close enough to notice the link. I didn't actually expect anybody to see it.
Appreciate your work on that.
You're welcome. So, does that work for everybody? Wait till the next meeting, give everyone a chance to review it and see if there's anything missing?
Another item on your task list. All right. FCC, NPRM, or NORS access.
So, on February 28th, the Federal Communications Commission issued a notice proposed rulemaking. This is something they've been working on for some time, back in 2015, I think. No, I don't know what year it was. Several years ago, the California Public Utilities Commission sent a letter to the Federal Communications Commission stating that the FCC should give access to state agencies to their national outage reporting system as well as their disaster information reporting system data. So every telecommunications provider, when they experience an outage, has to report to the Federal Communications Commission if it reaches a certain threshold. That outage information is then logged in the National Outage Reporting System. If the outage is related to a natural or man-made disaster, it also goes into the Disaster Information Reporting System. There's been talk of for some years that information would be very useful to state agencies. Not only agencies that are interested in getting a handle on how big of a problem or not a problem that local outages might be, as well as agencies that need that information or could use that information to help inform disaster response, like state emergency operations centers. The comment period will be 30 days after it is published in the Federal Register. To my knowledge, it has not yet been published in the Federal Register, but that could happen any day now. I've been working on some draft comments myself. So the question is, for the task force, does the task force want to try to file comments? One thing that I've suggested internally at the PUC is that perhaps we have draft comments for the task force to comment on, and then incorporate those comments into draft comments, and also send those comments to Colorado Office of Information Technology, as well as Colorado Department of Public Safety, and get their input as well, so that they're essentially joint comments from the commission, the task force, and those other two state agencies that may have an interest in commenting on this particular proceeding. Obviously, if it's going to be published in the Federal Register any day now and it's a 30-day comment period, we will not meet again as a task force between now and the comment deadline. So if we do this, it would all have to be done by email. So I want to get some thoughts from the task force as to whether you want to engage in this and whether you think that the approach that I've outlined is a good one.
Darrell, Joe Benkert here.
Yes, Joe?
I would just point out that the task force membership includes members of the service provider community who have opposed having these reports made available to the states. and may have a different position than the PUC. And the PUC may want to submit its own comments, even if the task force separately addresses it.
Right.
I think that was the one thing that stood out to me, this is Vicki, about the fact that we're representing such a wide range of folks that may have different interests that might be.
So the consensus might be difficult if we
Yeah.
just do it through an input or comment process.
Anybody else
Well,
have any thoughts?
Can I ask the telecom system provider representatives that are here today what your thoughts are on that? Do you think that would be an issue, or do you think it's possible that we could come to consensus
I don't know.
in a short period of time?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Sure, I don't know, I can speak to that.
Okay.
So speaking on behalf, this is Ray Paddock, speaking on behalf of Telecorp, we'd be open to that.
We probably wouldn't know until we see the input we get, right?
Well, I mean, I guess what we could do is you could solicit for it and then see what kind of response you get, decide from there whether or not we have something that we could actually file in that short time.
So in the interest of full disclosure, I'm also have scheduled a meeting with Commission Council to ask them what is appropriate in terms of if this is something that the Commission is going to sign off on, can they even get input from the task force and other parties without opening an official proceeding, which obviously we don't have time for. So we may not even be able to do it this way, but that would be my preferred approach if the Commission Council will approve it, but I'm not sure that they will.
Well, this is Vicki. The other way you could do it is to basically pull the authority boards and that kind of thing, the ones that typically file comments on these kinds of rulemakings. I mean, they can at least, if they have some awareness that this is coming up, that this is the opportunity for them to do that. I mean, that's where you typically see them.
Well, since there's a lot of question up in the air as to what we're going to be able to do procedurally, I think for now I'm just going to I'll commit to keeping you all informed as to what Commission Council says we can do, and then if we can do a collaborative process, I will make sure that all of you are aware of the opportunity to provide your input and incorporate that. My preference is always to do a collaborative approach because that has worked so well for us in the past, but sometimes we trip over our own procedures. Just the way it is.
Parties can also file informal comments, which can just be, for example, a letter uploaded through the electronic comment filing system at the FCC, and maybe we can provide, a short guideline on how to do that.
That's a good idea, and you can even just type the comments directly into the ECFS comment system. You don't even have to send it as a letter. So I can send that information out to the task force members as to how to do that.
Great. Anyone else? Next up, we've got the draft outline for the public education website.
So, this is why I don't take vacation time. A few months ago, this was actually at the end of 2019, the executive director of DORA, Patty Salazar, suggested to me that we should have an outward-facing 911 public education website. I asked at the last task force meeting what the preference was on how to do that, because I know that I've just talked about creating a GIS committee. We probably don't also want to create a public education committee. We have enough committees. And the consensus was that I should put together an outline, with the potential being that this is a joint task of both the 911 program at the Commission and the 911 Resource Center, which I think is a good idea to do this as a joint effort. To put together an outline as to what an outward-facing 911 public education website would look like. So in the link that's in your agenda will take you to a draft outline for that public education website, and I put it basically threw in the kitchen sink as to what I think a public education 911 website might include. I don't want to toot my own horn. I will say that I don't know that there's any public education website for 911 out there that includes as much information that's in this outline. But on the other hand, that might be a bad thing, because if it gets too full of different topics and therefore too hard to navigate, it might not be public user friendly. So I want to make sure I'm striking the right balance between being information rich and being public/user friendly. So I don't know if anybody's had a chance to look at that outline from the link in the agenda or not. But if you have any suggestions, if you think it's the right amount of information, if you think it's too much information or too little, I would be happy to take any suggestions that you have. Yes, sir.
Bill Dugan. On your concern about information, very basic at the beginning with a link of more info if they choose to.
Right.
So that very simple answer.
So format makes a difference.
Yes.
For sure.
Attractive to young.
And good to meet you in person, Bill.
That's why I came.
Yes.
That's why I risked it.
I don't think this is too much information. I think, as he said, it has to do with format, but I think it's great. I think it's a lot of good information.
The only other thing I had is, looking over this, something of how to get more information or who to contact, who's willing to take those calls or emails.
I nominate Monica. The resource center.
Yep.
Daryl?
Yes, sir.
On the foundation website, we have a directory of the non-emergency lines at PSAPs, so that people don't have to call 911, and other information on contacting the local authorities. That took weeks to put together and hasn't been updated in a number of years, even though people keep asking me to update it, but it just takes a tremendous amount of time. But that's something with cooperation from the task force, we might be able to, do more quickly. And you might want to consider including on this if you don't already have it.
Joe, this is Daryl. I didn't consider that at the time because I hadn't gotten the information yet that the Colorado 911 Foundation was closing down, but I think that's a terrific way to preserve that functionality and incorporating it in here. Holly sent a text message asking if the website would be accessible to people with vision disabilities, such as increasing the font size. I think that's a great idea. This will probably be built through Google Sites because that's the ability that I have through the state to build websites. And that's what we built the task force website in. I'm not sure what all the accessibility functionality is of that, but I'll make sure to research that and include as much of that as I can. And Holly says, of course, captioning any videos and providing image descriptions, which that part is easy to do. So I'm happy to make sure that that happens as part of this. And I think once we build it, we can also provide it to Luke or other members of the other representatives like Cheryl of the who are representing the disability community to make sure that we are meeting their needs.
The foundation also has sought to make our website multilingual. We never could find any volunteers who were willing to do the translation, but that's something we might want to look at as well.
Joe, I think that's a good idea. I've looked at Google Translate for that sort of thing in the past, but you never know what you're going to end up with there, and I don't want to take the risk. So we would probably want to find or even potentially pay for, if we get the funding to do it, someone to actually translate the website for us into at least Spanish.
Well, the other issue we had is when we did our public service ad, Dean, our guy who was producing the contact, I think it was Telemundo, to get a translation for the Spanish language versions. When we were shooting in Montrose, we had some Spanish speakers out there who did a translation, said Telemundo's was all wrong. When we were in shooting at Comcast Studios, we had a fireman who, I think he grew up in Mexico, but he spent his summers with his mom in Colorado, and he did another translation. And so Spanish isn't necessarily Spanish.
Bill?
They'll do, I've had success in the past with local colleges, especially in their instructional design, where they focus on getting the instructors to do their videos for their classes and the legal requirements for language and captioning and everything. I've had success with some local colleges helping with that sort of thing.
That's a great idea. Thank you. So I don't think I need any action on this today. I just wanted to make sure that you're aware of it, take a look at it. Unless anybody thinks this is a bad idea for any reason, I think I'll start working with Monica to start putting this together and incorporating your suggestions as well. But before we make it public, obviously, I will work with you to make sure that we've got everything right in there, and of course, it'll also have to be approved through DORA before I make it public.
Darrell, the one question I have is I didn't see this whole thing, but I noticed there was a thing on there about how do you get a recording of a 911 call, and would that impose burdens on PSAPs if it encourages people, from the public to just ask for call recordings?
So Joe, the reason I put that in there is because I get those requests a lot, because if they just look up Colorado 911, they get me. Right now, what I'm having to do is refer them to the local agency. If they have a place online they can go that has contact information for the local agencies, then maybe they can go directly. If anybody's worried that will create a higher demand for recordings, I can certainly leave it off, but it would be helpful for me, at least, if there was some place online that I could direct them to. But I do understand your concern. And maybe we could try.
I'm just asking the question. I think that's something that the operational folks would be more sensitive to or informed about.
If anybody has any thoughts on that, I'm happy to take that. Another possibility is we could start with that on there, and then if it does seem to be increasing demand, we could take it off.
If the answer is contact your local 911, the answer that you're giving, I don't see a problem with that because that's what it is.
This is Bruce. I don't see it as an issue. I think that the deterrent would be that everybody charges for these recordings. So they may call and ask, but probably won't go through with it unless it's really a necessary request.
And this is Darrell. Every request I've gotten by phone has been for pretty legitimate reasons. I don't think most people are calling just because they want to save it for posterity or something.
Okay. Anything else on that public education website? Right, up next I've got open discussion. Anyone have any items for open discussion?
Lunches for fifth grade?
Lively bunch today.
Yeah.
We're all subdued.
Fatigue isn't a symptom.
I think it's a result of all of this, not necessarily a symptom.
Right. Well, we're way ahead of schedule, but I just got word that lunch is here, so.
Okay. All right, so we're typically breaking for 20 minutes or something like that, and we'll start with the presentation. Is that about right?
Since we're ahead of time, I think 20 minutes and then we'll do the presentation.
Okay.
So,
Yep. All right, so we'll resume at 11:50.
thanks, everybody. I'm going to just, if I can figure out how, I'm going to mute the webcast until we get started again.
And for those in the room, for drinks, there's water outside and coffee. If you want something like soda or seltzer water, seltzer water, there's a break room, a big opening you can see over here. Just walk in there, you'll see there's a cooler with soda.
By the way,
correct.
Out and to the left, go down the hallway, there's the restroom. Everybody wash your hands before touching the food.
We have not gone to.
That's how you be
identifying. It's a level, at higher level, we would actually not allow responders in it. Is that kind of what you're thinking?
too, Mike.
Sure.
are unmuted.
Okay, guys, it's 11:53. Let's get started back up. Up first, we've got John Gottsagen with State OIT for a GIS update.
That would be me.
That'd be you. All right.
Did you send me those slides?
I shared it with you. Did you get the email? Did I share the wrong thing?
Yeah, I don't think that's it.
No, that's not what. I was looking at that document.
Okay.
In case that was confidential, everybody disregard.
That's right. Close your eyes.
There we go.
So, how much time should I stop at?
We're yeah, I'm sorry.
Well, we've got half an hour allocated for you, so would that work?
Sure.
Okay.
So, howdy all, bon appetit. I'm John Gottsagen, and thanks to Darrell and for having us here. In the back, sitting next to me, he's not here right now, is Tony Filipiak. He's our outreach coordinator, what we call our outreach coordinator, and he also manages our broadband data development program. So Darrell asked me to give an idea of what we're doing within OIT GIS, and I have to say that it just warms my heart when you're sitting in the back of the room getting ready to talk about your program, and someone just voluntarily out of the blue says, "You guys should talk to OIT GIS." Like, that was not a plug. I didn't prompt them, so it's great that some folks are aware of what we're trying to do. This may be a little GIS heavy, so I don't know how many people in here know about GIS, but what my intent is, and if you could just go to the next slide. What my intent is to just give you an idea of what we're doing within our GIS program at OIT, and the data that we manage, and then how we can help out the process, the Next Gen 911 and this task force and so on. So, excuse me, I shouldn't have eaten lunch before I spoke. So a while ago, we identified a bunch of objectives of what our office, what our program does. And really what we're about is trying to make spatial data. And by the way, I'm the state GIS coordinator. I've been with the state for about 15 and a half years. I'm also the chief data officer for the state. So I'm wearing those two hats, partly because there's a lot of overlap in the objectives of both of those kinds of roles. And one of those major objectives is making data available and discoverable across the state. And when it comes to GIS data, that could be local data, it could be state managed data. And then also, how do we make that data really useful for making better decisions? How do we turn it into information? So that's where I talk about maximizing the value and the utility of data. We're also supporting other agencies in their GIS activities. I'll talk a little bit about that. And there are certain principles that we like to operate under. So one of those is create the data once, use it many times. We don't want redundant efforts to maintain the same data over and over again. And actually within state government, when we've looked into this, we found that that's not as much of an issue as much as different agencies working on different aspects of the same data. And that doesn't get integrated into an overall kind of holistic integrated data set. So one example is road data that CDOT puts together, but then another agency may go and enhance that road data for their own use. And how do those enhancements then become available across the entire state? So sort of a corollary to that, ask, create once and use many times, is ask once and use many times. So when I started as state GIS coordinator, I had several local governments say to me, hey, why don't you guys at the state get your act together? I just got 3 or 4 requests for the same data from multiple different agencies. And so, why am I getting redundant requests like this? So we're trying to improve that process and streamline that process for how the state obtains local data, because so much of the data that we rely on at the state level originates at local sources. Public data should be public, should be open. That's just a primary principle that we have. And data value increases with use. From my perspective, the more data is used, the more we can enhance the use of data, the better for everyone. So those are just some principles. So we'll go to the next there, Darryl. So as I mentioned, there are certain core functions that we do. We try to coordinate as much as possible. So people know what other entities within the state are doing, and we can try to leverage those efforts. And so there isn't overlaps or conflicts. Developing data, maintaining framework data, distributing data, that sort of thing. And then also, as I said, supporting agencies technically. We've also helped out some local governments like Sedgwick County. We've had some discussions with Washington County, although we don't have the resources to go out and do GIS for them. Next, please. So just as an examples of some of the ways of more specifically about what we're doing, one of the big functions that we do is this broadband data collection. We've got a broadband, an application, an online map of broadband service and access in Colorado. We're hosting different GIS functions within the state, so that's what this ARC server and FTP site are and that sort of thing. And these are the agencies that we're actually supporting, hosting their applications. Does anyone here know what LiDAR data is? Heard of LiDAR data? So after the floods, in the Front Range floods in 2013, there was a massive amount of LiDAR data that was collected with resources from FEMA, from other federal resources. The state put a bunch of resources into it. We put together a plan for collecting LiDAR data across the state, and we got further FEMA funding. So we were involved in coordinating not only the collection and how that data, what would be priority areas to collect that data in, but also distributing that data. So we're rolling out a new site for disseminating that data. Hopefully soon. We've had some technical glitches on that. So just some examples of the applications of different agencies for water resources. The one I would point to at the top right, you can't really see it very well here, is our online broadband map. That's kind of an older image capture. The enterprise zones, that's something we're doing for the Office of Economic Development. So there's several agencies' applications that we have that we're hosting on our infrastructure. So that's just some background. What I really want to get to is the subsequent slides, which is one of our main purposes. And this actually came out of after the 2013 floods, where it was clear that if you're responding to an event like that, that we've got to do some serious coordination, and it's really appropriate for the state to do that in that case. Even though FEMA had a huge deployment across the street from the Emergency Operations Center for the state, they were looking for the state to take leadership to coordinate who was doing what and how is GIS data coming together. And could there be single sources to gather up data from the 15 counties or so that were impacted? And so that then led to some more support for OIT coordinating these data across the state. At that time, actually, we were collecting up data from counties, and I could say to FEMA, yeah, I've got data parcel data and address data from these 15 counties, and I can give them to you in one shot rather than FEMA trying to figure out who to talk to. So that was a huge help. So broadband service, we've been doing that for a long time now in terms of collecting of data about availability of broadband. Address points, which is important for NextGen 911, obviously. And I'll have a graphic about that. Parcel data, so ownership boundaries of lots, not exactly tax lots, but sort of. That's another data set that we're actively managing in the state. LiDAR I mentioned. Anchor institutions, that's a name that the NTIA gave this data set back in the day. I'm not in love with the name, and we haven't spent a lot of time maintaining it over the last year, to be honest with you. But that's the collection of health, public safety, education facilities, government facilities too. Other agencies maintain data, and so we've done some work, and we have to do a little better at it to actually tag those agencies as what we call the authoritative source of those data. So DOLA maintains municipal and county boundaries. And that makes sense because they receive annexations from municipalities by statute. Road data is maintained by CDOT, of course, because they're the entity that maintains the roads. Next, please, Daryl.
So can I, so this is my ignorance on that. You said that up to 98% of the addresses in the state are.
Right, so we've done some calculations that may be a little optimistic, but I think that that is 90, so we think we have 90 to 95% of the addresses, not the geography, but the actual addresses.
So not like $1, just addresses in general.
So the points. So what we do is we get from counties, we get the address and then the point location of the address.
How often are you collecting that?
We collect it annually right now.
This is Daryl. I'm getting some people saying they can't really hear the questions in the room, so if you have a question, make sure to speak up so that the mics can pick it up.
So the first question was, what sort of was that 98% a legit number, and were those just the list of addresses or the actual locations of the addresses? And that's what we collect is the point locations of the addresses. So, and then the next one was how often we do it. Right now, we do it annually. We are considering doing it more frequently, partly because we're doing some other work for some other agencies, like related to sales tax revenues. Yes, sir.
Bill Dugan, this might be a question for later, but are you having to ask for those updates? Or are you to the point where they push the updates to you when they make updates?
So so the question was, do we ask for the updates or do we just automatically pull them? And that's the next slide. It's going to be, we do an annual data call right now. So we ask for them. So we go to the counties and we say, can you please share these data with us? We've started to look into, or in the past, we've looked into how we could do that as a more automated process. We just haven't implemented that. There are some counties that would be, as you folks may know, that different counties have different processes for creating addresses, and that's part of the issue too. So we talk to the GIS offices. The GIS folks may get it from planning. They may get it from the recorder's office. There may be different sources of who's the address authority in those counties. And also across the state, there are different levels of capability in terms of GIS. So some may be ready for us just to do kind of a database pull based on some Esri database technologies or others. Some others may not be at that place yet. So this is one reason why I am presenting here and what I'm hoping is that we're doing this because we know address data is important. It's been used by several different agencies already. CDOT has used the actual data for planning purposes. What we do is we've created a geocoding service. So in other words, we publish as a service the ability to go in and say, enter an address and then get a coordinate back. So kind of like what you could do with Google Maps or with Esri. Our service allows you to do bunches of addresses. But what I'd like to do is, I admit there's some data cleansing that has to go on, and we probably have to do some work to make this address data more complete. What we want to do is leverage the overlaps in the needs for this data. So I mentioned, for example, we're starting to do some work with the Department of Revenue that has to create a system to calculate sales taxes for online purchases and other purchases, thanks to the Supreme Court. So that would rely on this data as well. So we have multiple potential uses of this data in the service, and let's leverage all of those needs to really get the best data set we possibly can.
Joseph Benkirk asked, have you sampled the quality of the data?
We're doing a lot of work now on assessing the quality of the data. So comparing it to, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I can certainly get back to you guys. So we do this data request, this data pull once a year. And we include requesting for address data, but also parcel data, also boundary data. I think one previous year we asked for PSAP boundaries, but we haven't sort of kept that up. So that's something we can do. Tony is actually talking to local governments on the phone, and he's going to be asking them about their status of their PSAP boundaries and other data sets you might be interested in. Yep, let's move on to the next, I guess. So here's the presence of our address data, generally across the state. And we have data from 53 counties. I think it's 53 or is it 51? It's 53, I think. And the counties we don't have data from are generally the Eastern Plains counties and Jackson. And so we think that that's because they generally don't have the capability to create that GIS data. The other thing that happens is that, if we can go to the next slide there.
Question on that though, can you follow up with them to see if that's the issue, or if there's some
Yeah,
other
well,
issue?
in this case with addresses, we know that's the issue.
Oh, okay.
And the reason is that when we get data from counties, we ask them, first of all, will you allow us to make those data public? And if the counties say no, there might be a couple of reasons for that. One is that they just don't want OIT to be the entity that does that. They want to sort of control that public dissemination of their data. Or there might be one county left in the state that actually still sells its data. If I remember, I can't remember now, but if they say no, then we say, will you allow us to share your data with other state agencies for state agency purposes? And again, there are some counties that say, yeah, we don't want you to do that because they don't like the state or something like that, I'm not sure. And if they say no to that, then we say, will you at least allow us to make your data available for emergency management and response purposes? So that's kind of the most inclusive of the data. So all the counties with color in there are allow us to share, at least for emergency management. The blue there is counties that say you can only share the data with state entities and for emergency management purposes. And then the green is, well, you can share it to the public if you want. And in many cases, they already share the data publicly, and they're just okay with us doing that. And what that also means is that when we aggregate the data together into one standardized data set, that publicly available statewide data set includes those green counties. What I'm hoping is that leveraging the effort like for the sales tax project is that we'll get more interest in sharing the data publicly because it means money in the pockets of counties involved. Yes, sir.
I can't see the legend from here. What's the orange ones?
So the orange ones are emergency management only. And then the blue is state and emergency management purposes. And then the green is everyone. And so I used to, is it safe to admit I'm not from Colorado? And I used to joke around that Colorado really is 3 different states. It's Utah, and then the Central Mountains and Front Range, and then Kansas. And then I realized, well, the Valley is really New Mexico, so it's 4 states. But the reason why I used to say that is because there's actually some real cultural differences, and not just like the obvious, but in terms of data sharing.
You forgot Southern Wyoming.
Oh, yeah, I guess. Do we have anyone from Larimer and Weld on the phone?
Larimer, yes, she just said offended.
So, and so in terms of data sharing and collaborating on GIS, when I started, there were fairly notable differences in how that happened. So I know Matt H is on the phone, and I've worked with Matt for years on this, and those guys on the Western Slope have always been really collaborative and always been really sharing their data, really open to sharing their data and figuring out how to work with people. So.
Anything for you, John.
Yeah, I know, thanks, Matt. Okay, so we also have a similar map for parcel data. And, it looks a little different. It's kind of interesting and this is because different entities within the counties may own these data differently. So a lot of times parcel data may be owned by the assessor's office. So that's why you see some of those differences. And next, so we haven't worked on the anchor institutions in a long time. So the ones in the darker green are where we actually got anchor institution data from counties. So we're working with the Colorado Broadband Office. We're not part of the Broadband Office, but and looking at how we update this data set and continue to maintain it.
Are you sure you don't have Montrose County?
Say that again, sorry?
You sure you don't have CAI data from Montrose County?
That may be where they just didn't provide it in the data call that year.
They got that Region 10 broadband grant. I think they needed to provide that data.
Yeah, so there were some issues with some of that too, like how we actually got the data from the contractors who were doing the grant work
Montrose or Montezuma?
Montrose.
Oh, yeah, we gave it to him.
All right. So, and actually the Montrose 911, that was a good example too, because a lot of the data we would get from that shop, and that would be 6 counties of data at one time. So, and for example, we work with DRCOG in that way too, where just as we at the state level don't want to duplicate requests for data, if DRCOG or Matt Shop is asking counties for data, we'd rather not make that request again. We'd rather try to work with regional entities who are doing this work already. So other data that, so these are the data that some of the data that the DataMark folks pointed out is important to NextGen 911. So I thought I would just point them out. PSAP boundaries, I mentioned, Tony's going to be asking the counties who has those. I'm guessing not that many, frankly, at the county GIS level when we first did that initial query, but that's just more, kind of hearsay on my part. We'll find out for sure. I mentioned the road data, statewide road data. It's maintained by CDOT. It's part of their federal mandate. Emergency service boundaries. So when we talk about that, we're not clear whether, I imagine we're talking about the actual service boundaries, not the boundaries of the service districts where they essentially charge mill levies. Those aren't always exactly the same things, is my understanding. So there was some work to develop that for fire district boundaries. And DOLA was creating some data on Title 32 special district boundaries. I don't know the status of that, but that's something we would have to do some work on investigating. And to be honest, I'm not sure what provisioning boundaries are, but that's what those Baker folks pointed out. Anchors of certain.
So they're having a side discussion in the chat about what anchor institutions are.
Okay. Right. So that becomes important for broadband because especially now with COVID, like if you're a health institution, how are you going to do telehealth? Which, by the way, my sister's a doc and she says, it's really hard to look down someone's throat to see if they have white spots on their throat in a telehealth sort of session, So there's some limitations. But obviously for something like that, you need to have good broadband service. So that's why in schools and education, that's why the NTIA was interested in that. Next, please, Darren. So several years ago, we just asked, again, counties, the county GIS shops, how many of you actually provide support for your emergency management agencies or entities? And so a large number of them did, which is an important and good thing from my perspective if we're going to help gather these data together to know that 80% of the GIS shops or GIS offices in the state, among counties in the state, are involved in that, then we know we can reach out to them to start getting this response, important information for response and recovery and so on. So during the floods, areas that were evacuated, traffic control points, flooded areas, damage assessments, all of that is like this dynamic information that we have to figure out how to get in a real timely fashion during an incident. I've mentioned this before, we're assisting certain local governments and state agencies. We can skip past this. I want to talk about open data. The state has what we call the Colorado Information Marketplace. Any data that's public, in other words, it's not subject to any security restrictions or legal restrictions like HIPAA or federal tax information or anything like that, we want to put on our open data portal. It's data.colorado.gov. To be honest, this is a little bit of an issue to get some agencies to say, hey, put your data here as opposed to something you've developed on your own. So I actually consider this the single space the single location to discover state data. Maybe not access it, but at least discover it. Find out, does it exist and who owns it? And the reason for that, I love to point this out, is that who here knows what department in the state actually regulates underground storage tanks for gas stations, oil and gas? Want to take a guess? What you think it might be?
Yeah.
It's not OIT. It's the Department of Labor and Employment. So, why should someone have to know about sort of the arcane structure of state government to try to find that data? So if you have a single place to discover it, that's the thing. Now, what we did here is after the floods in 2013, we created what they call the microsite to say, we're now going to coordinate anything related to the response to that incident in this site that looks a lot like the open data site, but it was access controlled. And so anyone who's putting data together could say, hey, I've got data about damage assessments in my county, and then other people could go in and say, oh, Boulder County has this data.
Are you doing a microsite for COVID response right now?
We're not, so it's funny, I've just been texting with a guy who works for one of the health information exchanges on data that they could actually provide to have a situational awareness of it. You get a little bit into some of these issues of like, well, whose job is that to present that data? And it really is CDPHE's job or the Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, because CDPHE, I mean, they're really the public health emergency support function. That's the Department of Public Health and Environment. And so they should be the ones presenting that authoritative information about what the status is of healthcare facilities and so on, and also the messaging. One thing that we've learned over time, especially after the fires that happened several years ago, you probably all know this very well, is that, you know, you have to be careful about the messaging and a little bit about the information. I mean, my preference is that if data is public, if the data exists, get it out there, especially if it's to other state agencies or to local governments. In other words, the people involved in the response and the recovery. Get the data out there, even if it's not complete, even if it's not perfect, because it's information people can act on. When you put something out to the public during the bad fire season a few years ago, there was an issue of people taking imagery of the burned areas and then looking at data from USGS and starting to combine that together and going, oh my God, my house is burned, or my house hasn't been burned, so I can go back into that area. And so it's an interesting little dilemma about you want to get information out, but you want to do it in a way that doesn't misrepresent, you know. Just one other thing, we have something called the Government Data Advisory Board, which is a collection of state agency people working on issues like data sharing, data governance, and trying to set sort of state approaches to that. The reason why I thought it would be interesting for you all to hear about that also is because of this COVID thing. I was sitting here thinking earlier today, like, I should have this body start thinking about what's appropriate policies and procedures for data related to COVID. Because what we don't want to get into is, frankly, what we've experienced in the past, where the proverbial stuff hits the fan and then people are making decisions on the fly about what data can be shared with whom and how. We're going to think that out ahead of time and have, to the extent possible, the technology worked out, but also the policies and the procedures worked out, so that, you know, the decisions aren't sort of ad hoc and kind of reactive. Yes, sir.
Is there public safety representation on that?
Yes, we have a member from the Department of Public Safety on there. Yeah, so there's state agencies. There was, it would be interesting to have different local representation on there. This was created by statute back in 2009, and it was very education oriented. So we had, members of a local school board and a local board of ed on there. But now it's less education oriented, and for those of you that are in the whole data world, you might know that talking about sharing education data is kind of a third rail. That's like, you talk about sharing data about students and the conversation just shuts down. And, you know, even if, one thing that I'm always very careful about is sharing data in the most secure and well-governed fashion. So I'm digressing a little, giving you some of my philosophy, but sometimes that security is thrown out as a little bit of a red herring, or people get overly concerned about security. So we need to, my preference, my philosophical preference is data sharing by default. It doesn't mean that we give up on security. It doesn't mean that we give up on proper privacy constraints and that sort of thing. But that what we should be talking about, especially in these instances, is how do I share my data? Like, that should be the question. How should I share my data? Not should I share my data? So that's That's just my little soapbox. And, you know, and I experienced it in 2013, we've experienced it other times, so. So that's the GDAB.
So this is Daryl, you said there's a representative from CDPS on there. Would there, given the duty of this board, would it make sense if there were local public safety representatives on there as well? Or are there any local representatives, period, on this board, or is it all state?
Not at this point because our local school district guy resigned last year. I think by statute, I think there could be a government, a governor appointed, you know, it says these agencies or others appointed by the governor, so we could ask for that.
Okay.
I think having maybe someone represented from the task force makes sense. Certainly someone from DORA, we need to get someone from DORA on there anyway. So all of those are options as far as I'm concerned. You know, a lot of the discussion about data sharing in the state often deals with HIPAA and health data. We've got some huge projects in terms of integrating health and human services data. And that's a whole other afternoon of discussion about that. But basically to improve the services that we're providing to Coloradans, we know that food assistance is related to health, which is, right, that's an obvious. So how do we make sure we understand those relationships and we're able to provide those services to people that need them? But I joke around sometimes like, oh, I'm tired of talking about, you know, health data all the time. Let's talk about animals or something. So if we get some next-gen 911 data on there, someone who can talk about this domain, I think it would be great. And it would add a little more interest to my life.
Matt, did you hear that?
So this might be, you know, how can we help? So there's talk about forming a GIS committee, obviously, so we'd be happy to help with that. We have GIS expertise on our staff, so we can help educate people on how GIS can be brought to bear, how you can maintain data, what are the types of analyses you can do, what are the issues you should be looking for. The coordination and collaboration I talked about, you know, let's just make sure that people know who's doing what, so there's possibilities to actually collaborate on projects and leverage each other's efforts. Setting standards, that was a big one that the Baker folks pointed out, and I know Darryl has brought that up, and I know Matt has done really good work on that out there too. You know, we can help defining those standards and help establishing standards for how data should be created, the structures of the data, and then the procedures about how data can be shared. And then this came up earlier, someone brought it up. What are other states doing? So we have connections to other state GIS coordination offices through a professional organization called the National States Geographic Information Council. So it comes up all the time, what states are supporting NextGen 911 through their GIS offices. And we can, I think it would be easy for us to pull that data together from that perspective, from what we know about state GIS coordination offices. Maybe a slightly different answer from your outreach to, you know, to the 911 offices within other states. But
Well, and I know District does a lot of work directly with MENA too.
That's right.
There's a lot of interaction, collaboration with that.
So one thing I think that's all my slides. What I neglected to put a slide on is how you contact Tony or me. So I can quickly enter that into a slide now, or you know, I can get that information to you. Would be happy to.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add John's slides to the meeting folder today. And since it's in a Google document, if you want to go ahead and add that slide later, it'll be there when I add it.
I don't know, I may have used up all my time, but if anyone does have a last question or two, I'd be happy to take them. Yes, sir.
Bill, so I understand correctly, you're willing to be the state repository as this moves forward?
Yes, I think that's within our function, yeah.
Having been through this a couple of times, that's a tremendous first step.
Yeah. One of the things that we're doing as we gather up data from local governments is right now, we have two different things. We've got an FTP site, and I just call that a big old bucket of data. not a whole lot of organization in that for the data sets that we don't manage actively. But we have it there so agencies can say, oh, I want to get, boundary data or stream data from these counties, and they can go to that FTP site and get that. And then, as I said, we actively manage some other data, and we make those available through Esri formats, through web services, and so on. So what exactly that looks like, the repository, we'll have to do some thinking about how that's structured and that kind of.
Do you have state demographers' data in your GIS system as well?
We don't have it in that one bucket that I talked about, because they're one of those agencies that say, well, we have our own way of distributing demography data. So hopefully, I think they've at least made it discoverable on the information marketplace. Yeah. And that's obviously going to be a big one coming this year.
Yeah.
Great. Any other questions for John? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, John.
To hearing from you.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Thank you, Joe. Are you able to just my PowerPoint? This is my personal computer. You need to load my personal computer. PowerPoint license is not expired. PDF.
Do you want to switch presenters? Because I can present it from my laptop. Or is that?
That can be done.
Yeah.
Are you logged into the webcast?
I am.
Oh, sure, you just present directly from your laptop.
I just need to not cause a tripping hazard. I'm slated for a laptop refresh.
Gotcha.
The battery is, it's fun right now.
Yeah, you have the same computer, right? In charge.
It's
I
this,
need to oh, there.
it's this powerful workhorse machine. The batteries. So don't trip, Stacy.
Yep.
Okay. So let me expand this. Make sure I go to do not disturb on my little chat. That's always fun.
So we're going to talk about the CAD to CAD project we're working on right now with 4 of the metro area PSAPs. I'll talk about the CAD to CAD, and then Deb's going to talk about, it's got a big GIS component to it that I don't think the group necessarily realized. They did realize it early on, but it's a much bigger part that it's playing than I think anybody envisioned initially.
Great. I think I'm just about queued up here. I'm trying. So, there was a present now. Oh, here we go, share. One last critical step.
You have to click on the screen first to select it. Share. Should pop up. There it is.
Go. I love it when technology works. Okay.
So just as an intro, I asked both Stacy and Deb to come and talk to us a little bit more about this because they've already been involved in our area with some of the collaboration from some of the different counties on this project, specific relating to the GIS.
Thanks. So Deb's been doing this stuff a while. Her title is Solutions Engineer. I guess I've been doing it a lot longer than she has,
come on.
but I'm not GIS, so I've been around the block a couple of times. So just a little bit about us. Deb does sit on a number of the work groups. Maybe at the end we could talk a little bit about, we are working with a number of statewide next-gen projects with GIS, so we can maybe answer some questions with that as well.
I'm very happy to have heard the GIS presentation. That was, I was holding myself back from trying to jump in as you were talking, so hopefully you guys don't get tired of the GIS topic on the whole.
I think I'm gonna sit so everybody can see. We're kind of extended.
Are we? Okay.
So I think, does everybody in the room know what GeoComm, what we do, all of our stuff? So this slide just kind of gives you a picture of that. that statewide or that nationwide map, those highlighted states are states that we're doing Next Gen GIS for. So 3 components. Everything we do is public safety. We're the only Esri, we're a platinum level partner. We're the only one in public safety. So software, GIS services, and then everything is public safety. So the CAD to CAD project, we got brought in back in 2018. I think it was called the North Area Fire Chiefs Group brought us in. They were having the initial discussions about, hey, we want to do this. We want this technology. So we kind of came in, and in that meeting was all the GIS folks, almost all of them from the metro area. We talked through what are the GIS components, what are the gotchas, what are the potential things that could be an issue. So we talked through all of those, and as a result, some of that made it into the RFP process that was put together. And in fact, the city and the county of Denver, I think, actually published that RFP. The participating agencies, as we see today, is AdCom, City and County of Broomfield, Thornton, and Westminster. So those are the initial 4 that are kind of working on this project, working towards this goal. So the solution, so we are providing kind of supporting services for the GIS data behind the scenes. We're also providing a common operating picture map application that displays all of this stuff. But the actual vendor, Emerging Digital Concepts, is providing that shield in the middle. They're providing the actual technology or integration between, I think in this case, it's Hexagon, TriTech, and Tyler Technologies. They're providing the integration between those 3 vendors to basically push and pull and for disparate CAD users to be able to see into other CAD systems. It's really, so it's not our technology, so I'm going to talk as best I can about it, but it's actually really, really neat. In their demonstration, they can show where they have an operational where one entity needs a fire pumper. They can see across the CAD to CAD to available units, resources, and other entities. So that's a very neat solution to make that happen. It does require integration with all those CAD partners, but it's a pretty neat solution. In fact, kind of a funny story, we're trying to replicate what we're doing here with a regional group in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia area. And we were in the presentation there, and they were talking about the sharing of resources. And the gal from Philadelphia's comm center said, well, we don't have resources to share. And everybody else in the room kind of started to laugh. They're like, yeah, we know you don't have any resources to share. When you do get resources, you can see them, you'll be taking our resources, but we can't take yours. So it was kind of a funny discussion. So the GIS solution, so one of the things that the RFP asked for was, once we put all this stuff together, we want a common operating picture map that shows the status of everything going through the CAD to CAD exchange. We want it web accessible so that you can get to it from an iPhone, an iPad. So in any given situation, perhaps the situation we're in now, you could basically see what's going on a big screen from your home, from anywhere. So that is part of the solution, and that's part of the solution that we as Geocom are providing. I think I've got a schedule that shows when all of this is in process right now. I think August, September timeframe, it'll be live and operational. So the GIS element. So Deb, I think is this where you kind of take the reins?
Yeah, and so I got brought in kind of earlier on in the process because obviously if you're standing up a common operating picture map, if you're bringing in data that's going to be used for validation of all these incidents, the thing that you need at the core of it is GIS data. That GIS data has to be gathered at the regional level. It has to be checked for quality. It has to be edge matched, and so that you don't end up with all these duplicate features. So we were going through the process and really identified that there was a need to first take a look at the available GIS data and its suitability for use in the project. So as the elements of this project itself, though, include that mapping component, and that the CAD systems that are in play would have to also consume that GIS data into their CAD system so that as the incident locations are transferred from one to the other, that natively within the CAD, the GIS data is built out to receive those incidents and validate them and share across those boundaries. And through the solution that's now in place to provide that data, it's that aggregated data set is going to be always available for people to download as frequently as people upload data with the most recent changes. It will be aggregated and made available for all of those CAD systems to consume. But again, we had to first look at the data itself and say, initially there's the 4 agencies that are involved in the project, but there's potential for more additional counties and agencies around the surrounding borders to add in. So we tried to define up front, who do you see initially being a part of it and who might be the next most logical add-ons? And let's look at all of the data for those agencies and just see what it looks like. And because we're a company that is looking at it from this perspective for the CAD to CAD, but also a company that has a strong Next-Gen 911 GIS component to it, we're gonna do an assessment that takes all of it into consideration. Because obviously, if you're starting a project like this for this purpose, there's clear ties to building it out as a next-gen data set as well. So we wanted to look at the data and see, some of the objectives were, is it seamless and routable? And I'm gonna pause on the word routable for a second, because for a CAD to CAD, you're thinking about vehicle routability. You're thinking about stitching the center lines together and making sure that you can route vehicles and really determine those nearest available units based on the connectivity of your road network. Later on, we'll talk about next-gen things. Routing a call has a completely different aspect for your GIS data needs. But there's enough overlap between the two that it still is a data set that can be viable for both purposes. So we looked at the data for seamlessness, routability, quality and integrity issues, the steps that are required for aggregation, and how is that data gonna work in these CAD systems? Because while every CAD system at its core has location validation as a function, everybody functions on a little bit different schema, different tables, different needs, different requirements. So how could we look at building a schema that would truly work for all of these different CADs? And again, you'll find a lot of overlap. There might be differences in field names, but the content of those fields and the purpose to which they're applied are very similar across the board. So that's what this was. Everyone loves spreadsheets, right? So we looked at the.
It's a little bit of an eye chart.
Yeah, right. So we looked at the tables, we looked at the different agencies that are contributing, and we looked at the specs for the different CAD companies that they had in place. And then how does that schema match? Where do they need to do some tweaking locally and build it up so that their CAD system can consume and utilize the regional aggregated GIS data? Some of the other things we noted is that every CAD system has a unique ID. So you're familiar with this problem, is when you have CAD systems in place that are deployed and live with their GIS data, every feature has a unique ID in place, and that unique ID has linkages to many, many, many CAD tables that tie in all sorts of related information. So when we're looking at bringing in more data into an established CAD system, you have the potential for duplicate unique IDs or the need to change unique IDs. So we highlighted in as part of our assessment that this is something to take into consideration. You can work with your CAD agencies to come up with a different numbering system, or to, in a logical and planned way, start to change out some of those IDs so that it can facilitate this building out the data. It's not insurmountable, but it will take some work with the local CAD companies and through your support contracts to make it happen. The other thing was provisioning boundary. John, you were like, what's this provisioning boundary all about? So one of the things that we identified a need for is the provisioning boundary as defined for NextGen is really about a GIS data authoritative boundary. What is the cookie cutter for the different GIS submitting authorities? What is their boundary, and where do you cut off those features so that you can then take the neighboring data set and apply the same cookie cutter? Because what we found in our assessment was when we got data from Westminster, Thornton, Broomfield, and then our own maintenance contract with Jeffcom and Denver and everybody, when you have a sort of a siloed approach to your own CAD system and your own needs, you have a need for the data within your boundaries and usually some connectivity and some spread outside those boundaries. Well, when you start to put together all of these data sets that come from public safety and everybody has that spread, I think in Westminster, we found some places where there were double, triple, quadruple features for the same streets and the same addresses because everybody had a little bit of that sort of amoeba-like spread outside their boundary. So we defined a need to say you need to build a provisioning boundary that applies that cookie cutter and says this is where your features stop. And then the project that we have in place right now to aggregate that data, which we'll get into in a minute, you can apply a code that basically says you don't have to necessarily alter what you're doing locally, you just have to add a code so that when we ingest it, we eliminate everything outside that boundary and everybody follows the same protocol. And suddenly you start to get clean, single representation, stitched together data. And I'm a GIS data geek, so that's a very exciting thing for me. But then in a next-gen context, you need the same thing. When you're talking about stitching data together for next-gen and that data is going to be used for routing your calls, you don't want to have multiple potential locations where that location is and which PSAP boundary it might fall within to route that call. So the provisioning boundary comes into play there because it defines those boundaries, and it also serves the need to, who do you report an issue back to? If you find a problem in the data and it's going to prevent it from being provisioned into ECRF, LVF, next-gen components, who do you need to go to fix that error? And is it a critical error it needs to provision now and you need to call somebody to fix that error right away before it provisions? That's where this comes into play. It used to be called the authoritative boundary, and people had problems with the authoritative boundary, so they changed the name to provisioning boundary. But that's really its purpose. And then the larger footprint of that provisioning boundary also serves to define the area of operation for an ECRF or an LVF in the next-gen component. So there's a couple different purposes for it, but there was an identified need to build one for the purposes of this CAD-to-CAD project, and that's part of the scope of services that we're doing as well. So what we also found in the assessment for the region was that there was 100% coverage, as in we got address point and centerline layers for all of the submitting agencies that we assessed. Now, the extent of their completeness of coverage within that area is always a little bit of an unknown, because every time you take a snapshot of GIS data, it's just that, it's a snapshot, and it's changing all the time. But everybody had it and could provide it. PSAP boundary, it wasn't present, but we looked at it and it could likely be determined from a combination of the fire, EMS, and law. Provisioning boundary, again, it's in development for this CAD-to-CAD project. It can be built out for next-gen purposes. And then a regional GIS NG901 data standard document would assist with streamlining. These are some of the things that you've heard before, and you're looking at standing up this committee, and I think that's a great idea. Now, every state that we've worked with that has gone that route to stand up a standard has usually used the NENA Next-Gen GIS Data Model Standard as a core, and then expanded on top of that if there are local needs. And that's completely logical, is to say, yes, we want the data to route a call. We also want to maximize our investment and use it for these other things, add a couple different requirements. So many, many states have gone that route. And then the other thing is when we did this assessment, we were looking at, we also looked at the NENA GIS data model for those layers that I'm talking about. We use that as our guide in the assessment, as well as the CAD readiness. So this is some of the feature counts and the errors. We did find a decent amount of errors in the data, but it was also, some of those errors are things that might only apply to next-gen and weren't immediately needed, and then we could shift focus to the CAD and say these are the critical things that you need to look at. And part of assessment for NG901 data readiness is also the synchronization of MSAG and ALI, because you want to make sure when you transition, right, you don't leave any ALI records behind in that transition, that every telephone record is covered. So we assessed that as part of it as well. And we found some pretty decent rates. There's always some local differences in that, and there's always a need to take a look at MSAG and ALI synchronization with the data. We find that a lot of places. We gave validation results and priorities to the local agencies so that they had kind of a to-do list to go through the data and say, these are the things you need to focus on to build the data up for use within this project. Same thing for address points. Some of the things we found, no matching street names, things that could cause issues with location validation. And we provided these quality reports that show, here's kind of where your error counts are and your percentages. This is something that now that they have also contracted to do this on a repeated basis to serve the needs of that mapping system and the CAD-to-CAD data, they'll be able to see these results improve over time. It's a repeated thing, and the reports just demonstrate as they work on the data that the improvement goes up. And it's using the system internally. It's a system that we use for projects as well as in the state solutions that we've implemented. It's really a site that allows you to drop in data You've configured it, field mapped it so that your local GIS is all, you don't have to make big changes to your local GIS, but you can map it over to a common field structure. And we customize the checks again for the CAD needs as well as NextGen. So it's something that can show those results over time as when is the data ready to go into the CADs, how is it gonna function in the map, and then this ongoing view of what does it look from a NextGen perspective. And this is just because we all like pictures. This is really, this really puts it from the dry bullets into a more visual. This is what we're doing. We're working with each agency. We're pulling the data in, doing some QC and conversion into a common data model, coalescing it at the regional level, and then provisioning it out to these different CAD systems because we've designed a schema that will work for all. And while it's not included in the current project, this is a system that is built for NextGen purposes as well. So it can easily provide a feed out to additional NextGen elements. It's usually just a different requirement of the output. And that's again, really how we designed it to be, because if you're doing an investment like this, you want it to be used for multiple purposes. It just makes sense.
And I'll just add, as those 4 departments, they're busy working away at updates as we speak. As they make updates, I think on a monthly basis, they're uploading the data they've worked on into the Data Hub, and the Data Hub then kicks them out a report card and basically says, here's where you're at. So maybe they started at a 55% match rate, and they can see the progress as they're getting stuff done as they're uploading. And obviously the goal is to get them to 98% or wherever they need to be.
Well, and for anyone that's GIS in the room, you'll appreciate the fact too, it's not just a PDF that you get saying this is your error counts. You get GIS features that you can zoom to and look at the exact details of what is exactly wrong with that feature, why is it failing this check, and make an alteration to your source data to correct it, so that the next time that you upload it, it passes that check. And the same thing is if some of the checks you can run are really just pointing out addressing flaws, like odds on the even side of the street, or out of sequence, or just some of those things. And it's kind of, people just assign bad addresses. You've never heard that, right? That never happens. But you can look at those, and you can also assign an exception code that just says, this is wrong, we're not gonna change their address. You have a point exactly where it's at, it is a valid location, stop telling me about it. We're not gonna change their address. So.
Has it been removed from that percentage check?
Yes, yeah, the percentages go up because it's not a problem per se. It is valid. It is exactly where it's supposed to be. It's just wrongly assigned. So.
Out of curiosity, do each of these agencies have a dedicated 911 GIS resource?
Pretty much.
Well, we're working with, oftentimes like with, let me think, Thornton, Broomfield, Westminster, they're GIS departments, not necessarily staffed and funded by the agency, but rather by the city GIS department. AdCom, I believe they are the only ones that have a dedicated GIS person staffed and funded by the agency.
But I think in all 3 of those other ones, that city GIS or county GIS, they are responsible for maintaining the CAD data.
Correct.
So that
I
they're,
was gonna say, because usually there's a disconnect between how important it is. And,
Yeah.
So I was just wondering.
Yeah, and
as we move forward with the state, because that'll become important for the agencies get involved.
Well, and because when you don't have that dedicated staff, you're talking about going to a city or a county department that their GIS department serves a whole range of business needs.
Oh, exactly.
Right. And that's why, with the exception of some tweaks that were needed for the CAD systems, we try to limit any schema changes or local changes to the data necessarily, because we know that that data is beyond public safety. It is sourcing into a wide variety of asset management and other types of systems. So we take what exists locally, we map it into our public safety schema, run checks on the public safety schema, and then report it back to them in a way that they can go back and make changes in their local schema or make changes to their local data, but for the most part, leave the schema as is, because a lot of times it is pretty well complete.
And you're leaving it to those folks to check the data.
No, we check the data. So
they run it through our application that checks it for them.
Yeah, when it goes into the GIS Data Hub, it's an upload site, they upload a zip file and it runs through all these QC checks. and then automatically sends them the results back so they can start working through a fresh set and look at the latest quality results.
Have they, one of the things that we found actually in the past is we've said to some of the local governments, well, we looked at your data, are you interested in hearing
Right.
which data, which elements, features are not correct?
Yeah.
And sometimes we get, well, not really. And I think it's partly because of what you mentioned about they already have this defined workflow about how they maintain the data and all that kind of stuff, and they don't know how to take these changes back into that workflow.
Exactly.
So have you dealt with that? Or
Yes.
are you getting that kind of response? And
Yes.
how do you deal with it?
So, well, for this project, not as much because the entities involved so far have already had a pretty dedicated staff to making the changes and maybe not had the ability to design their own checks. They're interested to know, they want to know where there's errors, but it's more so that they want to fix them, but they don't have the bandwidth and capability to fix it. So it's not that they just don't want to hear about it, it's that they want to know what's going on, but they don't necessarily have the staff, the funding, the capability to fix it.
Right.
So to just draw a parallel to another project that we're working on, we just kicked off with the state of Oregon. This is where at a statewide level, Oregon State Police have a CAD system that 8 years ago they went live with, and at the time they didn't have a great GIS resource to pull together statewide data that they needed. So they put together what they lovingly refer to as FrankenMap, and they haven't touched it since. And so they had a definite need to start figuring out a better solution, a more sustainable solution for that. And we started these conversations, and it really became about there was a need at the state police and an ability through a different state agency, the Office of Emergency Management. They had an existing GIS and MSAG funding policy that would support those GIS needs and both development and maintenance of data. So we were able to, through discussion, and then later they put out an RFP and we responded to it saying, this is where you need to partner between two state agencies to share data. They already have the mechanism in place, all of the data sharing agreements, and it was limited to purely public safety use. So they were able to provide that data for us to do a project that would build it for a statewide CAD and yet incorporate checks and the purpose of NextGen at the same time and report back to source agencies. Here are the things that you can work on that will have implications for CAD and for NextGen. And here's the thing, if you're already maintaining this locally for your local CAD, a lot of times the CAD checks are kind of universal. So if you work on it locally, it's gonna improve your local operations in this CAD as well as for the state system. And then through a funding policy, they have the ability to fund that effort. So
Funding helps. Yeah.
yes, it all comes down to funding. So in this case, there are city GIS departments that are already supporting the local CAD systems. They're on board for getting this information back. There is, yes, I think it will be a little bit of a struggle to get everything done in a drop everything, focus on this and get it beautiful for go live type of sense. I think that's where we're hitting a little bit of a struggle. But we're still in this phase of the project, we're still designing those checks. We've done the initial assessment, they've had time to start working on their data, and now we're gonna give them a fresh set of results as soon as we get it all established, so.
And we're hoping that the results they get that show improvement will keep morale up.
Yes. Yes, we want people to see the data is improving. And we don't want to throw nonsense results that, that's why in our structure of the checks, we want to kind of highlight, well, here's NextGen and here's CAD. If you want to prioritize, look at the CAD, because that's going to help you locally and immediately. NextGen is a bonus, and you know what needs to be done, and as you have time, you can work on those results as well. And it makes it more palatable to people that get this kind of load of results dumped on them. I don't have time for this, right? But again, through different funding mechanisms too, they can look to outsource some of that help to build the data, clean the data, whatever needs to happen. There's always a solution. It's just priority, immediacy, and availability of funds, right? So the current status is,
Yeah, so current status, Emerging Digital and us are building the application. They're working with the CAD vendors basically looking at August. And I think they're going to be able to show that to the, what is the group called? North, yes, yeah. So that'll be the group that gets to see it first and see, put it through its paces, and then it'll get released to the dispatch center. So all that is happening now. As Deb had mentioned, the agencies are working on data, working on it now, getting that stuff ready, finalizing those PSAP boundaries, the cookie cutter, to make sure what everybody submits is just their piece to submit. So things seem to be moving along fairly well. I think we're having bi-weekly conference calls.
Yep.
There's a process in place to kind of keep everybody motivated moving along.
Yeah.
So,
So unless it's really a long answer, I'm assuming there's some process you're gonna leave in place.
Yeah, so the question was, is there a process in place to maintain it? And really, it comes back to this data hub solution. It's, I don't know how many years do we,
either 3 or 5 years, they'll have a subscription to that. So they'll just, basically the process they're doing now, they'll continue to do for the next 3 to 5 years.
yeah, and it really consists of, we're now in the initial stand-up and configuration of everything. And as soon as that is complete, it becomes just a lather, rinse, repeat process. You just upload data, get your results, work on your data, upload your data, get your results. It's just an on and on cycle for the maintenance period. And then, it's been an interesting process to stand up the checks. And like I said, we're configuring them now, but we wanted to make it useful and sustainable, because you don't do a one and done build for something like this. That's what happened in Oregon. They stood up Frankenmap and then they couldn't do anything with it and they couldn't replace it. And so that's that we kind of applied that same logic to that project as well, is you have to find a way to find a data source and an ongoing capability to keep that data up to date, refreshed, and accurate for your needs. So. Yeah, so the takeaways.
Yeah, just kind of summarizing, the system will go live later this year. All of the contracts, whether it be our Data Hub subscription, or the application, the EDC application for CAD to CAD, all of that was kind of put through the RFP process and structured, knowing and hoping that other agencies would join, because it's kind of a pilot process right now. We hope that others will join. So basically just letting everybody know that that's out there and available. I think between City and County of Denver and AdCom, those two, it's through their procurement processes. A byproduct is kind of this next-gen data analysis process that those agencies are doing. We've also worked with El Paso Teller on using the same process to do their analysis, as well as Sterling and Logan County, as well as Jefferson and JeffCom. So there's folks here that are going through this process that others can certainly start to go through as well.
Are you guys aware of the North Central All Hazard region? And
That's this.
Yep.
That's
So they're the ones who are funding.
That's where the
Yep.
funding's coming from.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Yep.
Yeah, it's been a good process, but it was nice to identify at the outset that sort of take a step back and look at all of the data and see how it's gonna come together. Because I think that was the one thing, is you need the data, it's critical for all of these systems to function, but there needed to be a plan for where that data was coming from and buy-in from the local GIS authorities that they will make these improvements.
Questions? Otherwise, we appreciate the time
Yeah.
and the opportunity.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, appreciate it.
All right.
Yep, that's it, unless you have anything else for the group.
Do we have a motion to adjourn?
One thing, I want to let you all know, I did get a message from Jackie Louise. The 911 funding bill did pass the Finance Committee today, 7-3, so we passed through one more hurdle.
Cool. Very good. That's great. All right, guys.
Hey, Daryl,
Nope.
Yes.
did she mention anything about that amendment, if that was passed as well and introduced?
Yes, it was. The Lifeline amendment was passed.
Fantastic, thank you.
Yep.
Anything else good for the order? Anybody else? Gotta Got a motion to adjourn, can I get a second? Second. Second, all in favor? Aye. Thank you, everyone.
Hi, everybody.